Facts. Yeah, facts. We tell you facts. All the facts.
Well, why don't you tell us about Silvia Moreno-Garcia?
Yeah, I'm gonna do it. So, as I did with NK, I have some fun facts. One thing I'll put a note after I give little fun facts, but it's like hard to find stuff about alive people. I want them to stay alive and keep being alive for a very long time, but it's like doing biography stuff is like, unless they've written one, you look for it's just interviews and it's cool. But they have some fun facts. Big one being that they are the same age as N.K. Jemisin. They're only 41. They're still young as heck.
And such a baby face.
Mm-hmm. So like their career is just beginning. Like they already did like a ton of stuff, but like they're gonna just keep doing awesome stuff, which is cool. They have a really interesting educational background. Specifically, they have a master's degree in science and technology studies from the University of British Columbia. Specifically, they wrote their thesis on eugenics, women, and the work of HP Lovecraft.
That's amazing.
Which is just fascinating. Like, just so cool. Like, not that eugenics sucks, but like, it's very interesting that like they just have like all this knowledge, and then like all this knowledge is now being like channeled into fiction and like worlds, so that like people can like kind of learn about them in a creative way instead of like by reading a ton of nonfiction. And I just think that's pretty cool. They don't just stick to one genre. They might write many different genres. And the reason for that is funny, and I'll get into that, but it's really like they need to make money to make life good, and they'll write whatever does that. And also there's like their whole thing is that they read a ton of stuff. So they read from all different kinds of genres. So like they really have the knowledge to write in all different kinds of genres and do so, which is cool. One of their books has a really cool playlist called Signals to Noise. It's a book that they wrote in 2015, and it has like a cool playlist filled with fun music. So I also recommend picking that up.
Why?
Oh, cool. Nice. I didn't get the why. I was just like, it's cool that exists. So just as a general note, alive and fairly young people don't always have a ton of information out there about their lives, their histories, etc. One, because like they still got to live a long time, and you don't want your business all out there. I get it. Like, that's reasonable. Like, you have a lot of life to go. And like, why? I'm not going to tell everyone my entire life story either. Like, it'd be weird. So I get it. But with that being said, like, as thorough as I would love to be in this, I don't have all of the information. There were like gaps and stuff like that. So I just kind of pieced together a lot of different interviews. And I highly recommend reading these interviews because they're really interesting, and we have them in our blog. But yeah, I was not able to get as thorough as I think a traditional biography would, but I did find some really interesting things and anecdotes and stories, as well as like a lot of words from them, which is the best way to receive this, I would assume. It's just from hearing from them themselves. Spoken by me, but their words. And yeah, they're just super interesting, and I highly recommend checking out a lot of their interviews. Like, even though I haven't read a lot of the books that they're talking about in the interviews, it's all really interesting stuff. So a little background. Silvia Moreno-Garcia was born in Baja California, Mexico on April 25th, 1981. Her parents both worked at a radio station as journalists, so they've always had a lot of books and like writing and literature in the house. They have a family full of storytellers and writers, and that's kind of like a generational thing. That's pretty cool. Her mother was very into science fiction and fantasy. There were always classics in the house like Dune and Tolkien. And they also had more modern authors for the time. As I said, they were born in 1981. So her mother had a lot of authors who were coming popular in the 1970s, like Tanith Lee and Anne McCaffrey. And in an LA Times article that Gabe showed me, Silvia mentions that her mom was a sci-fi and horror fan. She read Frank Herbert's Dune, Stephen King, and she had a love affair with HP Lovecraft's work. There are stories she grew up reading as well. These are the stories that she grew up reading as well. And her mother had many books in the house translated from English into Spanish, and some in English as well. Silvia loved books, and this love of books and stories was generational, as her great-grandmother was also an oral storyteller. In the LA Times article that I mentioned, she spoke on the influence of her great-grandmother, and As she could not read or write, she spoke a lot of her stories. And Sylvia recalls, so for her stories were told, not written, and everything had a place. You couldn't rush my great-grandmother when she was speaking. You let her talk. You trusted her. And Sylvia was very impacted both by the stories that her mother shared with her, but also the stories that her great-grandmother spoke to her, and said that it really shaped her and her love of storytelling too.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in Mexico, Sylvia learned English from kindergarten on. She noted that there weren't many children's books available specifically in Mexico. And she grew up really immersing herself in like older fiction, like fiction not written necessarily for kids. Specifically, The Three Musketeers, she read at the age of 8. And this really helped develop her vocabulary at an early age, and challenged her in reading like books that were not written specifically for kids. And this influenced her to read so many different books because like it was really just like read whatever you can find that you like. And she really leaned into that heavy. So she read everything in Spanish and in English, from the Bible to mythology and anything she could get a hold of. Reading was her passion, and she spent a lot of time in a Mexican chain bookstore called Gandhi Bookstore. She noted that reading wasn't especially common in her social class growing up, as she grew up with not a lot of money. But because her parents were both journalists, they spent money on books, and they always had a lot of books in the house. And because of this, a lot of people thought her love of reading was odd, like people like her in her age group. But yeah, books were the main thing that her family would end up spending money on. And luckily, a lot of the older books were inexpensive. When they were young, they were very impacted by the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. And this was one of their first introductions into horror literature. After Poe, they discovered HP Lovecraft, and that is something that deeply impacted their life. In fact, they even said that, like, of the people, if they could like meet anyone who was dead, who was a writer, they would want to like meet HP Lovecraft, and like show them things from modern times to be like, what do you think of this? What would that be about? But yeah, so this love of the works of H.P. Lovecraft deeply impacted her life. And they went on to write their master's thesis, as I said, on eugenics, women, and Lovecraft. They eventually also edited anthologies inspired by Lovecraft stories, and also like made it a point to really seek out to rewrite a lot of the narratives in there, and like make them her own. Ultimately, they read as much as they possibly could across genres, fiction and nonfiction. Whatever they could read, they would read. And while reading was her passion, writing became her passion as well, out of like financial necessity. They spent a lot of time in school, and don't mention that leading to much, if any, financial prosperity. They got a bachelor's degree in the States, and in 2004, they moved to Canada to get their master's degree, as stated above. It seemed that a lot of their motivation came from loving learning and wanting to learn as much as possible as a way to make sense of the world, and not like originally, like a lot of her schooling kind of oriented around things she was just really interested in, and not really to get money. But what happened as a result of that, which I can relate to that because I did the same thing. I was like, I just want to learn stuff so that the world makes sense. And so things don't feel as crappy. And then I was like, wow, that degree got me nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. Who's going to pay me money to talk about history if I don't have a teaching degree? So she ended up facing something similar in that she graduated and the job offers didn't just come pouring in. As I said, growing up, they didn't have a lot of money, and the need of money is kind of what really influenced their branch into writing, because it was like a way to kind of gain financial independence. They even go as far to say that writing was their only marketable skill. So they got into writing because it was the only thing that they could think of that could make money to help their family. In an interview on Locust Mag, they say, I started writing fiction because I needed money and I was depressed. I wrote King of Sand and Stormy Seas and ended up selling it to Shimmer. And that was one of the first stories I sold. After that, I realized I could sell, and that maybe I did have a marketable skill. We had immigrated to Canada. My husband was working 2 jobs. I had a baby, and I couldn't get full-time work. I was doing journalism for this weekly rag, writing stories like $40 a pop. Sometimes they wouldn't pay with cash. They would just pay with food coupons to a bar where I would take my baby and eat. My mother was sending money for Mexico, which was very shameful. You move to another country to make a better life, and then your mother sends you $100 so you can cover the rent. We were burning through our savings, so I was just in a really lousy place. Then I sold the story, and I thought, I can do it. The good thing about commercial speculative fiction, as opposed to literary fiction, is that markets tend to reply fast and they tend to pay. They may not pay much, but at the time, getting $20 or $30 was big, and I could write with a baby on my lap. I was doing freelance journalism anyway, so fiction was just one more thing I could do, and then at least I would feel like I wouldn't feel so horrible, like a POS loser. You graduate magna cum laude, and everyone says you're going to be great. I'm going to the States with a scholarship. I was supposed to be the smart person, and then you live in a horrible place and you've got no money. I was hanging out with a baby all day and wondering what happened. My friends were doing great things, and I was like, how did I end up here? So writing stories made me feel better, and because somebody appreciated it because somebody finally appreciated what I was doing, and it brought in a trickle of cash. Then I got a job, a horrible full-time job. I was working in video production, and it was terrible. Minimum wage and soul destroying. I got a better job doing communications in an office, and things were economically stable, but I kept doing the short story thing because I had gotten used to it. I could crank them out. When you're a journalist, there's a deadline. A lot of times writers talk about, writer's block. And I'm like, that's bananas. If you're in journalism and there's a 5 p.m. deadline and you don't have your copy done, you're fired. I come from that mentality. Even with a full-time job, if I had an hour in a day, I could crank out a story in a couple of weeks. It's just a process. It's not magic. I had a friend who was studying creative writing, and she was writing 1 story a year. She was done with her degree. She had 2 or 3 stories, 5,000 words each. That's ridiculous. You need to exercise your writing muscles. That's the only way to get better is to write. So I just thought that
That's amazing.
That was a really cool story. And it was cool. I was like, that is a long quote, but all of that is super interesting. So it needs to go in here. And essentially that experience really shaped her creating spaces for people to write and creating more spaces for herself to write and her people to write. So they worked with their friend Paula Stiles, who was also living in Vancouver, and they were looking at gaps in the publishing market, and they noticed that it was heavily saturated with white men and very little else. If there were women, yeah, right? Oh, what? White men doing it? Taking over everything, just not letting anybody else do a thing. So weird. So they noticed the industry was heavily saturated. If there were women, they were white women. The industry was missing BIPOC people and women. They looked online and noticed that there were people writing who wanted to be published within that demographic. And a lot of them, they looked online and noticed there was an internet filled with forums of women who were really into weird fiction, into Lovecraftian horror and other things. There were women who were fans of the genre, and some of them really wanted to write and were already writing, but weren't getting published. Silvia and Paula came together and realized if they weren't getting published, but had the energy, the skill, and the passion for it, maybe they could create a place for it. They had to make space for them since one didn't exist. So they created Innsmouth Free Publishing. Innsmouth Free Press. And from this idea, they started as a magazine and a small website, but they did have to downscale it at some point because it got really busy. And they made several anthologies and books, which resulted in an all-women Lovecraft anthology called She Walks in Shadows, and it ended up winning the World Fantasy Award. They described it as a place for the women men don't see, and therefore nobody sees, which is just really awesome that they made this space and that they did so and that it's working, They also work to translate works by authors who haven't been translated to help get their work to English reading audiences and to get them more presence. In terms of what they've been doing lately, she's been getting published and winning awards, a bunch of them. She's also performing and doing talks at places. There are none in Philly. Sad. But they have some in Chicago, a bunch of other places that you can find on their website. Sylvia is an author of a number of critically acclaimed novels, including Gods of Jade and Shadow, that won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, and the Ignite Award.
I think it's Ignite.
Ignite, that makes sense. Words, Ignite Award, and Mexican Gothic, which won the Locus Award and the British Fantasy Award, Pacific Northwest Book Award, Aurora Award, Goodreads Award. They won a bunch of awards. And Velvet Was the Night, which is the finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and has won the McCavity Award. So we'll be covering a book that wasn't on that list called Certain Dark Things by her next week. And it's one of those needs more attention because it's really interesting. I mean, I'm only on chapter 2. Gabe's read the whole thing and said it's great. So I'm going to go off of that. And by next week, I'll have read the whole thing and I'll probably be like, wow, that was such a great book. Everyone read it. But as I said, I read a lot of interviews. And in all of these interviews, she said a ton of just really interesting things that I think people would like to know about. So in one specific one on pen.org called The Pen 10, an interview with Silvia Moreno-Garcia, written by Jared Jackson, she answers some cool questions, like kind of how I pulled for, I think it was NK, just from their website of questions that they've answered many times that people might find interesting. I kind of just pulled from this specific one because I really liked the questions that the interviewer asked. And I quoted some of them below. I didn't include all the questions because we'll be covering Mexican Gothic at a later date, and I didn't want to give accidental spoilers ahead of that content.
Got it.
And also go read it because it's great. But one of the questions was, what does your creative process look like? How do you maintain momentum and remain inspired? She says, I look at my checking account. I know that sounds flippant, but I feel many times you're not supposed to accept the material realities of working in the arts. I like writing, but I also like eating. So I've taught myself to write efficiently within the constraints of my life, which include a day job, a family, and stuff like that. The hard part is not inspiration. That's easy. It's the other stuff that takes a bit of juggling. But I tell writers who are starting out to figure out what their pace is like and stick to it. If you write 500 words a day, Monday to Friday, you'll have a short story in a few weeks. The next question is, what is one book or piece of writing you love that readers might not know about, which I thought was interesting. And they mentioned Thomas P. Cullen, who wrote 3 great novels beginning with the letter B, The Beguiled, The Besieged, and The Bedeviled. And they had to fish the Besieged from the vaults of their library, which is interesting. You just can't find it in print, they say. His other 2 novels have been recently reissued, and The Besieged is what might be called a potboiler. It's a multi-point of view novel where every point of view is unreliable. I wish more people would know Charles Williams, who was a great noir writer and has been oddly forgotten. And not enough of Rolo Diaz's work has been translated. He's a wonderful noir writer too, and I think the only book available by him in English is Tequila Blue. I believe Rolo Diaz might be one that they have worked to translate, but I'm not 100% sure. So don't quote me on it. But they have worked to publish lots of writers who don't have their works currently in English, and I think that's one of them, but if not, maybe one day. What advice would you give to young writers? Read everything. Nonfiction, fiction, memoirs, novellas, pulp, obscure stuff, the canon and the obscure. Writing is a constant conversation with yourself and with literature. You can't have that if you've only tasted one dish. So she kind of practices what she preaches. She reads everything. So she's saying, if you want to be a good writer too, go do that too.
Yeah, well-rounded.
Because you're not going to get the full picture from just one variety of stories. You really got to read a little bit of everything. As I said, mentioned before, they really liked HP Lovecraft's works. So which writer, living or dead, would you most like to meet? What would you like to discuss? I think I'm obliged to say that I'd like to reconstitute Lovecraft using his essential salts. I did my thesis work on him, and I feel in a strange way that I grew up with him. In a way, he was one of my best friends as an awkward kid growing up in Mexico City, which sounds bizarre, but it's true. I don't know, however, how the conversation might go. It would probably be very stilted, but For the most part, I'm like a turtle and I don't want to meet anyone. And I just want to live inside my safe, cozy shell. That's why I like the internet. I can interact with people without having to let people see me. As for talking, I like to talk about books nobody knows about and old movies. So I'd probably show Lovecraft the movie Get Out and Annihilation and see what he thinks.
What do you think about Get Out? That's such a good question. Like, you know what?
Yeah.
You're right. Right?
Yeah.
Whoa. You're right.
Well, yeah. And I thought it was like a good combination of things. Get Out and Annihilation. Both of those movies are entire trips. So
Yeah.
I imagine he would be like, wow.
Yeah, Annihilation's really good for him. Or
Yeah.
like Lovecraft Country. I wonder what he would think of that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I bet it would be. You'd probably be like, why? Wow.
Whoa.
But also maybe you'd be like, maybe in the afterlife, he has gone through something that has maybe made him different. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. We'll never know because that's what happens when people
You die. That's it.
Yeah. I don't know. But why do you think people need stories is the last question I'm going to cover that she answers. And she says, humans seem to love explaining the world through narratives. With many of my characters, I think one of the elements that unites them is that for good or ill, narratives shape them and have a great impact on them. In Gods of Jade and Shadow, my protagonist is on a quest while also understanding that this is a quest. And in Mexican Gothic, Naomi has read Gothic novels. I probably lived my entire youth through books and films. You know that line from Iris, when everything feels like the movies? Well, to me, everything felt like the movies and the books. So all in all, Silvia Moreno-Garcia is super interesting, hella inspiring, and paving the way for writers who often don't get the recognition, financial backing, etc., that they very much deserve. And I don't know, I'm very much looking forward to reading as much of their books as I can and to take their advice. Write stuff, read stuff, and I recommend you do the same.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's so that's like the rule that every writer says. Like when you're like, how do you? They're like, you just write. You just do it.
Even if
you can't get better unless you do it.
And I'm like, honestly, yeah. Just do. Just like take a minute and just write a little bit.
Yeah.
So maybe we can both start doing that game every day. We just write. And even if it's horrible, we'll be like, all right, but it's there.
Yeah. I mean, you can't get better unless you are horrible first. Like, no one starts out with the final draft. Like, you got to start somewhere. And like, that's what, as a production consultant, that's what I'm telling people all the time. It's constant. Just me being like, you got to do it. Like, how do you expect it to get any better?
Yeah. I mean, I was at that random with my friend Jess. We went to see Neil Gaiman speak, which I didn't ever think of doing until that moment. But we went and I was like, all right. And what he said was that your first novel is going to be trash. It's going to be a pile of garbage. So if you stop there and wait to get that published, you're never going to get published. Just keep writing stuff. Your first novel is not going to be the best. You're going to go back and read it. Because he even said that about his first novel. He's like, I went back and read that and it was garbage. In fact, I thought that was good. Horrifying. I hide it in my attic and it's never coming out. Like, you're never going to see that novel unless I'm dead and someone has gone up there and taken it. So you're just right, even if it's bad, and it's going to be. And if you're
like
writing,
our first
don't
episode.
Stop. Oh my God, right?
Oh,
We're
we refuse.
Podcast,
Yeah, no one's allowed to listen to that one. So
yeah. And honestly, I had not listened to podcasts, so I shouldn't have been making one. And now I do a little bit more. So maybe that's why we got better.
Yeah.
Because you were just like doing it. I mean, we were both bad, but you were better than me. I was just
how you learn. You got to learn.